Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glendivid Books. 1962 has left a question hanging in the air which almost after 60 years still hasn't been adequately answered. How much of the responsibility and blame for the debacle that India suffered in Chinese hands rests squarely with Jawaharlal Nehru? A book published recently seeks to answer precisely that question. Here it is. It's called The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949-1962. And the author is India's former Foreign Secretary and former Ambassador to China, Nirupama Rao. Mrs. Rao, in the introduction to your book, you raised the question, why did India and China stumble into war in 1962? And you answered it by saying, the so-called follies of Jawaharlal Nehru cannot be the simple or default answer. But after reading your book pretty thoroughly, the overall impression left in my mind is that the major share of the blame rests with the wrong assumptions behind Jawaharlal Nehru's policies, his misreading of signals from China, and his inexplicable conviction that China would never go to war with India. I'll come to details in a moment's time, but let me first ask you, how do you respond to this overall impression? Because clearly, I don't think it's the impression you intended your book to create.
Thank you, Karan, for inviting me on your show once again. Well, my book, it is true, lays bare the nature of the policy decisions that were taken in regard to our China policy, of which Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, was the main architect. I don't deny that. But what I have tried to offer is a nuanced analysis and a recounting of what happened during those 13 fateful years in regard to our Tibet policy, in regard to our China policy. And let me thirdly state that Nehru was the first person to own the failure of his own policy towards China.
Let me ask you one more general question before I come to the details that your book discusses. You say again in your introduction that Nehru was no strategist, and then you go on to compare him to Isaiah Berlin's fox, someone who knows many things but finds it difficult to deduce the core meaning of any of them fully. That indictment, in my eyes, corroborates the impression I got from your book that the overwhelming blame for the debacle rests with Nehru.
Well, Karan, that's true that I said that I compared him to Isaiah Berlin's fox, but that doesn't detract, I believe, from the overall personality of Jawaharlal Nehru and his unquestioned devotion to the national cause. I do not deny that at any point. So I don't belong to the tribe of people who have made blame Nehru their gospel truth. So that is not my gospel. I believe that you cannot question Nehru's motives, but perhaps you can fault his judgment, for instance, of Chinese motives.
So in a nutshell, your position is that the primary responsibility for that debacle does not rest with Nehru. And your position is also that Nehru has a share of blame, but it's not the majority blame to accept.
Well, I would not come to that conclusion entirely, Karan. Nehru was the Prime Minister of India. He was in charge. He took it upon himself to create and to activate, let us say, our foreign policy. So in terms of that, Nehru's personality and his persona loom large over this landscape of the India-China relationship during that period. His assumptions that China would never turn differences with India over the border into a military conflict, I believe, was a fatal flaw.
So in a nutshell, are you now agreeing with me that the primary blame, the primary responsibility is Nehru's?
Nehru himself did not absolve himself.
No, but what about your position? You're the author.
My position is firstly that we were dealing with a country with which we had had no experience previously, diplomatically, let us say, of interaction, one. Two, I believe Nehru believed that there was a moral efficacy about his approach to China. And I think there was reason, there was rationality. He was assuming that India and China could be a third force in world politics.
Because you're not answering my question. I'm interrupting because you're not answering my question. It's a simple question, and then I want to go on to details. Was the primary responsibility, the primary blame for that debacle Nehru's? Yes or no?
Well, yes, I believe that the decisions that Nehru took in regard to China, some key decisions after the Tibet Agreement of 1954, the decision to show our boundaries as fixed and determined, which in a sense really put him in a corner as far as reaching a negotiated settlement with China was concerned. His decision, for instance, to publish the white papers and therefore leaving him with very little space or elbow room to really talk to the Chinese, to negotiate with the Chinese. And thirdly, as I said, his assumption that the Chinese would never enter into military conflict with China. For all this, I believe he is to be blamed, as you mentioned, to be blamed for what happened. But he himself accepted.
Once again, because this is critical, you began your answer with the word yes. So that means the primary responsibility and blame is Nehru's. You said yes to that.
No, I'm not in that black and white zone.
So then if it's not,
I do not say that Nehru is guilty as charged. I do not say that. I think that you have to, and that's the purpose of my book.
I'm not saying that either, Mrs. Rao. I'm not saying that either. I'm just asking a simple question, and I'll then come to details because I think it's important to come to details. Is the primary responsibility Nehru's? Yes or no? Just give me one word answer, yes or no.
I would just give a qualified yes to that, a qualified yes. Okay. Not an unequivocal yes. No, I do not.
Okay, I'll accept that. Let's then, having established that, because I think it clarifies things for the audience, come to the details that emerge from your book. And I'm going to start with the western border in Aksai Chin before I come to the eastern border, the McMahon line. Nehru, you say in your book, was convinced that the boundary in the east had been well defined before colonial times. But the truth is, and you point this out as well, that at no point had China actually demarcated it jointly with India. At independence, as you point out, there was no boundary line shown on Indian maps. Then later maps showed the boundary line as undefined. And it was only sometime in the 50s that the boundary line was shown as defined. So clearly this progression means that this was unilateral action by India in the hope that China would accept it. Now, that was an error of judgment. Would you agree?
That is exactly what I said and referred to in my previous answer, Karan, that Nehru, it was a sin of omission, let me say, on his part, to assume that China would accept the boundary as shown on our maps, that there was no need to discuss this or negotiate this with China, because an international boundary has to be mutually agreed between the two countries that straddle their frontier. And in that sense, that was a fatal error that he made.
Now, it seems the second error, and this emerges very clearly from your book, is he ignored reports by Reuters in 1953 that China was building, and I'm quoting Reuters, at top speed, a motor road. And this was being built in territory that India considered its own in Aksai Chin. But not only did Nehru ignore the Reuters report of 53, it seems he also ignored corroboration of this in 1955 from the Indian trade agent in Gartok, a gentleman called Lakshman Singh Jhangpangi. So this means that India had claimed territory without actual proof that it possessed it. And now when it got proof that the Chinese were trespassing and in occupation of it, Nehru chose to ignore those reports. That's the second error, surely.
Karan, this is not a drum court martial of Nehru that we are conducting here. let me first say that, yes, Nehru was conscious. I think he deep down, subconsciously, was aware of the fact that the boundary in the Western sector, particularly, had existed in some kind of a gray zone because of the very hostile nature of the terrain there. But let me also add parallelly that as far as, and you said you'll come to the northeastern eastern boundary, and we will of course discuss it, but do not disregard and do not take away from the fact that Nehru and his government took steps to extend our administration right up to the McMahon line, which I think was one of the most astute steps that could have been taken.
Let's take the McMahon line later. Let's stick to the western boundary first. We'll come to the eastern later. Let's not confuse the two. But the point I'm making now is that the second error of judgment was to ignore two successive reports, one by Reuters, one by India's trade agent, that the Chinese were building a road in Aksai Union territory that Nehru believed and claimed was Indian. He ignored those reports. That was another mistake, surely.
Well, I from the study I've made and the research I've made, the impression that I have gathered is Nehru himself was not completely persuaded or convinced that we had full control and full jurisdiction and full reason to state to the world that this was our boundary. There was a shadow of doubt in his mind. Well, and that's not the reason. Please let me complete. That's not the reason why he I don't even know whether those reports about the Reuters report about the road, or Lakshman Singh Jangpangi's report about the highway had been exactly brought to his notice. I'm not sure. But that is where I say that there is culpability, there is blame to be attributed to a lot of sections.
Listen to what you've just said. You said you are not sure Nehru was himself convinced that India had control and possession and ownership all the way of Aksai Chin. And yet, in 1954, Nehru deliberately authorized the issuing of maps which would show this as Indian property, as Indian ownership land. So if he didn't believe we owned it, why issue maps that show this as defined Indian territory? That's another contradiction.
Yeah, that's the question that we ask with the benefit of hindsight. But you and I have that benefit of hindsight today. We have 20/20 hindsight. But
come. That's a poor excuse. That's you don't need 20/20 hindsight here. You yourself said Nehru wasn't convinced India owned all of Aksai Chin, and yet he chose in 1954 to issue maps, and he gave instructions they should be issued. Your book has those instructions, that this should be shown as Indian. You don't need hindsight to realize I'm making a mistake.
He did, I think, ultimately realize he had made a lot of mistakes about China policy, about frontier policy. I think he realized that. But you are right, at that point of time, when he took the decision to show our boundaries or to authorize that our boundaries should be shown as fixed and determined, I think the whole issue of Aksai Chin had not been properly studied, had not been properly examined, and we did not have a strategy at that time in terms of how we would approach the issue.
Thank you. You've actually proved my point. He gave instructions to issue maps showing the whole of Aksai Chin as defined and definitely Indian, and yet you say the situation hadn't been studied, we weren't clear in our minds, Nehru himself had doubts. That simply makes it even more clear that Nehru's policy decisions were not based on factual positions, and they were mistaken and they were errors. But let's come to a third error. And I'm quoting from your book. Despite the decision to show external boundaries of India as firmly defined and delineated, Nehru did not follow up with actual occupation of the areas. So we were showing to the world from 1954 onwards that all of Aksai Chin is Indian, and yet he made no effort at that point to show any presence in the area we claimed was ours. That's another mistake, surely, because if you claim it's yours, then you ought to start building structures there to prove it's yours.
Well, with whatever you call it, mistake or error, I would say the shortcoming here was that, yes, occupation was not extended in the Aksai Chin. But, the whole question, we're here with a chessboard and moving, the various figures on that chessboard. But in the Aksai Chin, extension of administration was no easy matter. The the nature of the terrain there. The Chinese, it is true, were building a road, and that was an intelligence failure on our part, an intelligence failure that we were not aware of this at that time. And most importantly,
forgive me.
Please let me complete
It
for the
wasn't an
benefit of our
intelligence failure.
viewers.
No, Mrs. Wright, it wasn't an intelligence failure because your book reveals the Reuters report of 53. Your book reveals Zhang Pangi's report of 55. So the government knew. And Zhang Pangi was the Indian trade agent. He wasn't a newspaperman like Reuters. So the government knew. You can't claim it's an intelligence failure. It is a failure to heed intelligence. That's another matter.
There were many compounded errors here, but I think the most significant error that we made, that India made, whether it was Nehru or whether it was the government, the significant error was the decision to ignore the advice of the then governor of Bombay, Girija Shankar Bajpai, that we should raise the question of the boundary, at that time unsettled, with China during the Tibet talks of 1954.
I'll come to
and
that.
Nehru acted against his better instincts in following the advice from Ambassador K.M. Panikkar.
Absolutely. And I'll come to that in a big way in a moment's time. But when a man acts against his better instincts, that's another lapse of judgment. That's one more lapse of judgment against Nehru. But one more point about the East before I come to the West. In 1961, Nehru began implementing the forward policy and occupying territory in Aksai chain, which was neither under the control of China nor under the control of India. It was a sort of middle no man's land between the two countries' positions. But the bizarre bit, and you point this out very clearly in your book, is that Nehru launched this policy without realizing that it would provoke the Chinese to retaliate. That was an error of judgment, not to realize they would retaliate. But the second associated error of judgment is that the posts that were set up as a result of the forward policy were so small, they couldn't withstand any attack. So here was a man launching a policy that's going to provoke the Chinese, but doesn't realize it will. And then the posts he set up can't withstand that provocation and end up getting attacked and pushed back. That, to my mind, compounds all the errors on the East.
Karan, you are taking a very simplistic view of my book, I'm afraid. And that was not the purpose of my writing it. Our intention here is not to reduce Nehru to pygmy status. That's not. I think what I have tried in my book is to delineate his approach, his judgments, his decisions, many of them flawed. But I've tried to give you and the readers a human quotient of what happened during those years. And that was my purpose. Absolutely. I agree with you. The forward policy was implemented. I would prefer to use the term that the late K. Subramaniam used. I think it was a surveillance policy. It was not so much of a forward policy. These were little penny packets that were established in areas, as you said, the Chinese had not yet occupied at that time, and which were far, far west of the Aksai Chin Highway. The second error was that the government, all sections of the government, including the military establishment, assumed that the Chinese would not seek to attack, and this action was not provocative. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and I think a bitter lesson was learned from that. So there are lessons to be learned.
Can I point something out? This belief that the forward policy wouldn't be provocative and the Chinese wouldn't retaliate was a belief that was held in 61 when the forward policy was being implemented. It would be half understandable if the forward policy had been implemented in the 50s with the belief the Chinese won't retaliate, because the relationship between Beijing and Delhi in the early 50s was very different. But by 61, and that's after the failed Zhou visit of 1960, it's hard to believe and accept that a prime minister could have credibly said to himself, I'm going to carry out a forward policy and the Chinese won't retaliate. I mean, that is a massive error of judgment, because he knew that the 60 visit had failed. He knew that the relations had deteriorated. And then to carry out a forward policy in those circumstances and still believe the Chinese won't retaliate is bizarre.
But by 1961, post-1960, I don't believe Nehru was the prime mover of this policy. His ability to maneuver, to manipulate, to provide for space in dealing with China had been completely restricted. There was a literal asphyxiation of what he could do because Parliament was up in arms. Let me tell you, Parliament was up in arms, public opinion was up in arms, and as a leader in a democratic setup, please tell me how he could have operated. Could he have just overruled all the opposition that he was facing on his China policy? You know, he had to be seen as more nationalistic, more patriotic, more defender of the motherland than anybody else. So these were errors. I do not.
What a strange excuse! You're saying to me that
circumstances should be studied properly.
Mrs. Rao, what a strange excuse! You're saying to me a prime minister with a 2/3 majority in parliament at the time, and don't forget that, and it might have been pretty close to a 3/4 majority, was under pressure from parliament, his own party, from public opinion, and therefore he almost knowingly did the wrong thing by carrying out a forward policy, which he should have known would provoke the Chinese, when the atmosphere and the relationship was so poor that it was almost certain it would, and he yet did it because he was under pressure from parliament and public opinion. That makes him seem like a very weak man, a man who could be pushed into doing the wrong thing against his better judgment. That's not a defense of Nehru. Now you sound as if you're making my case better than I was.
I'm not here to play to the galleries. I know that there's a whole constituency out there that wants to blame Nehru, that wants to put him in the dock, that wants to guillotine him on this issue. I do not belong to that category of people. What I'm saying is that you have here a figure, the first leader of our country, who I think his motives, I don't believe you could question his motives, but as I said earlier, you could fault his judgment on China, his assumptions that China would never turn differences with India into a military conflict. But I think it's a measure. No, take the issue of Tibet, his impatience with the Tibet issue. I see that also as a shortcoming on his part.
Let's stick to this one by one, but I'll take what you're saying and underline it. You can fault his judgment. All I'll say is when a prime minister's judgment is being faulted, it's about the worst indictment you can make of the man. It's judgment that you look for in a prime minister, particularly in a tricky and difficult situation. And if in that situation, the judgment is faulted, it's a huge lapse. But let's now come to the eastern border, which we haven't talked about. This is the McMahon line that used to run between China and what was in India called Nifa at the time. Now it's called Arunachal Pradesh. You point out in your book that the McMahon line was delineated in March 1914. But you also point out that the Chinese never accepted it, and they repudiated the Simla conference where it was agreed to. And Nehru knew this. And yet, despite it, Nehru insisted that the border on the east was defined and settled. And yet he was aware that the Chinese had reservations about this. So to take something as defined and settled when the Chinese are themselves making clear that they're not happy with the McMahon line, is again another lapse of judgment.
Again, Karan, we are playing to the amphitheater here. I'm not.
No, we're not. Can I clarify that? I am not playing to any amphitheater. I am simply raising to you questions that I indicated in my first question, the doubts that your book sowed in my mind. All I know about this subject is from your book. You said that Nehru is not to be the simple and default answer, but your book convinced me that in fact the majority blame is it, and I'm not putting those details to you, so I'm not playing to any gallery. I don't care what the BJP and Mr. Modi think, because I think that's at the back of your mind. I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm simply raising the doubts that emerge from the evidence you've given. It's in your book and I'm putting it back to you.
I come back to my basic principle that Nehru made errors of judgment. There's no doubt about that. But I've tried to draw a picture of a very human figure when it came to his policy on China. And I do not question his devotion to the national cause at any time. We are all human and we make mistakes. And Nehru was not Zeus on Olympus. I'm not saying that. He was certainly not that. He did make errors of judgment, and we've talked about it. I think the other error he made was adopting, as you said, being a prisoner of public opinion and adopting a very rigid position on negotiating a border settlement with China. Because you just referred to the McMahon line. It's true, the Chinese regarded it as illegal, but they settled on the basis of a section of the McMahon line with Burma. They called it a friendship line, if you've read that part of my book. So it was open to India also, especially during this 1960 visit of Zhou, to arrive at a negotiated settlement where China would have recognized India's administrative jurisdiction up to the McMahon line without calling it by that name. And that was a mistake.
This is the second point I wanted to make, and it's revealed by your book brilliantly. The first point, I'll just recapitulate it for the audience, is that Nehru insisted upon taking the McMahon line as defined and settled, even though he knew the Chinese did not believe it was legal. But the second point is even more important. The Chinese position was that they didn't like the McMahon line because they saw it as a British imposition. In fact, you point out in your book that Zhou said to Nehru that China was prepared to accept all India's claims south of the line. He simply wanted, and I'm quoting from your book, the boundary line has to be fixed by negotiations, and he added, which brings no defeat to any side. So what he was saying is that let's renegotiate. We'll come to the same line more or less, but this time it will be a joint India-China line, not a British imposition. Surely, at least with regard to the East, this is something Nehru should have accepted. He was getting what he wanted, but providing the Chinese with a face saving so they could say, we've renegotiated it as they did with Burma, and now we've arrived at maybe the same line, but it's a jointly agreed line, not a British imposition. Why could Nehru not have agreed to that?
I think the entire focus on the nation was on the Aksai Chin Highway and the Chinese occupation in Ladakh. Unfortunately, that was a kind of refracted, partial vision that informed the Indian approach to China at that time. Nehru, public opinion, parliament were all concerned looking at the Aksai Chin Plateau and why and how the Chinese had occupied that area and blaming Nehru for what happened. I mean, he was completely cornered at that time.
Mrs. Rao,
he was in a labyrinth when it came to China policy.
But Mrs. Rao, again, look at your defense of Nehru. You're saying that the attention of the country or of parliament or the government was focused on Aksai Chin, so they didn't realize that with regard to the East and the McMahon line, actually, the Chinese were giving them what they wanted and still refused it. I mean, that's the defense you're making, and it's very strange.
No, Karan. You seem to assume that we just had to accept what the Chinese were offering on the McMahon line and say, okay, let's call it a friendship line. Let's call it a line by any other name would be just as sweet. That was not the case. The case was that China was offering this as a package. What China was saying is you recognize and accept what we have occupied in Aksai Chin. Let's draw a border in the West on that basis. And on that condition, we will also agree to the line as you draw it in the eastern sector of the border. That really was the case. So let's look at this not in a unidimensional way, Karan.
Okay, let's then come to what I call the opportunities that Nehru missed to resolve the border issue. And I'll start with the one you mentioned earlier, but I didn't let you talk about it at that point. I want to bring it up now. Surely, the process that led to the Tibet Agreement of 1954, whereby India gave up its privileges in Tibet, was an ideal opportunity for Nehru to also, as a quid pro quo, settle the border dispute. In fact, Nehru's biographer, who you quote in your book, Sarvapalli Gopal, says that securing a clear and explicit recognition of India's frontier at a time when India had something to offer in return had been lost. He had, at that moment in 54, when he was negotiating the Tibet Agreement, leverage to get the Chinese to agree to terms that would be acceptable to both, and didn't use it. That's a major opportunity that was lost, and surely that's a major fault on Nehru's part.
It's certainly a missed opportunity, Karan, and I do not absolve Nehru of the responsibility of having taken decisions that ultimately were to cost India very dearly. And I don't think he had the benefit of foresight in the way that we have the benefit of hindsight. We are all assuming that here we had an infallible leader. I think Nehru had his faults, had his weak points, had his weaknesses, particularly when it came to China policy. But let me also tell you that there was definitely an awareness on his part that when it came to the frontier, India's frontier should be consolidated. And that's how in the Eastern sector you saw that happen. The problem was in the Western sector, there were issues of terrain, there were issues, just the lack of infrastructure. Let us also put that on the weighing scale.
Not just there were lots of problems, but the opportunity to settle was when he had leverage at the time of the Tibet Agreement, and his own biographer says so. I mean, the word Sarvapalli Gopal uses is India had something to offer in return, and that opportunity was lost. Now, do you know what the consequence was? And again, I'm falling back on your book. All my arguments I keep underlining for the audience are actually from your book. They're not something I know separately. Everything I'm saying is a case you built up against Nehru. But the consequence, as you point out in your book, is that India ended up without a proper strategy for tackling the border issue. Instead, India assumed that China's silence on its maps was actually acquiescence. And you make clear in your book that, in fact, that silence wasn't acquiescence. China was simply waiting for the right moment to raise the issue, which means
exactly. So
which
even
means
if
that
we
India ended up accepting its own assumptions without any corroboration from China and then behaving as if its assumptions were fact. That's a terrible position for any prime minister to put the country into.
Now, Karan, that's the way you put it. I put it, in a more elliptical fashion. But anyway, we can agree to disagree on some parts of what you're saying. The point is that I have said in my book that it was an error of judgment for Nehru, and his group of officials assisting him, not to have raised the question of the boundary and sought a settlement as a quid pro quo for giving up our rights and privileges in Tibet. Okay, granted, that premise is granted. Now let's turn to the Chinese side. The Chinese were not prepared to discuss the boundary. Zhou Enlai took the approach that only questions ripe for settlement should be discussed during the 1954 talks. I agree, even on the basis of that approach, that India should have probed the Chinese more about the nature of their response on the question of the boundary.
Can I intervene?
And also,
can I make a point?
And if that had happened and if they had disagreed, I think we would have had a better idea, a better perspective of how to transact China policy in the years following.
No, I'm making a different point. China may have taken the position in 53, 54, 55 that we'd wait for an appropriate time to settle the boundary. The Tibet time is not the right time. But if India had said, hang on a second, we're not going to withdraw our privileges in Tibet unless you have a quid pro quo about the boundary, we want to settle it together, China would have changed its position, or might have. We didn't even attempt to change China's position. Instead, under advice from Panikkar, which contradicted, as you pointed out, the advice coming from Vajpayee, Nehru believed, let's not raise the issue. Let's not disturb sleeping dogs, in other words. The Chinese haven't said anything. Let's assume they don't have a problem. We'll carry on quite happily and therefore not stir embers that perhaps will just die out. That was a terrible error of judgment.
It was delusional diplomacy, certainly, Karan. I've mentioned it as such. And as far as the Chinese were concerned, it was diplomacy by stealth. I think they wanted to consolidate their positions and then, just...
Mrs. Rao, let's at this point come to what I call a second opportunity to resolve the problem that Nehru missed. And once again, I'm relying entirely on what you've written in your book. I'm referring now to the compromise offered by China in about 1960. The Chinese said that they would accept India's claims in the East, i.e. the McMahon line, and in return they wanted India to accept China's claims in the West, i.e. Aksai Chin. Now, this made eminent sense because it meant that both countries would get de jure control over what they anyway physically controlled, and there would be no real loss of actual territory that they were controlling on either side. Surely, this is something Nehru should have agreed to.
I don't think the country was prepared to accept that offer. Again, Nehru did not obviously realize the consequences of what these fateful decisions would be. And I don't believe the country is still prepared to accept such package deals. I don't want to go into those details. But the fact is, at that point of time, the Chinese offer could not have been accepted, whatever its merits or demerits. Secondly, I also want to add, and that is clear from the book, that the offer was made very elliptically. I mean, the Chinese have this ability, the capability, the tendency to go back on many of these things. Their positions have hardened over time, as we have seen. And even at that point of time, it was a very, very tentative offer that had been made.
I agree. The offer was made elliptically, but it could have been shown interest to, and that might have made it a more confirmed offer, but that didn't happen. And just as an aside, I'll add, Shyam Saran, in a book he wrote 2 years ago, points out that a very similar offer was made in the late 70s, I believe, when in fact he flew down to Delhi to tell Mrs. Gandhi about it, but it got no further because I think, if I recall correctly, her principal secretary didn't put it up to her in time. But leave that aside. What you're saying leads to what I believe are two lapses of judgment that I want to end by discussing. The first is that Nehru failed to prepare India right through this 13-year period for the need for a domestic consensus on a territorial settlement with China. It's something he should have been talking about and preparing the country for, but he didn't do it. And in fact, let me quote you. You say Nehru's priority and the true test of his mettle would have been preparing the country for a territorial settlement. Well, he failed that test, didn't he?
Well, he certainly came short of it. I don't know if he would have tried it if the nature of the environment in India had been different. You had this whole surge of nationalism, and I think he was inundated with it and he literally drowned in it, Nehru.
Now, the second lapse of judgment, and again, it emerges very forcefully from your book, is his conviction that China would not resort to war. Your words are, war with China for Nehru seemed unthinkable. And you say not only was this a flawed assessment and a flawed assumption, but worse, the defense budget between 1957 and 1960 shrank just as tensions were growing. This is again another inexplicable lapse of judgment on his part.
All this led to what happened in 1962, and that's what I have tried to write about and to describe. I've just tried to give an honest appreciation of all that happened during those years. And as I said at the beginning, my intention was not to, put the dunce cap literally on Nehru. That was not, or make him walk the plank, as we have tried, or maybe your questioning has pointed in the direction of. That was not my intention. My intention was to educate a young demographic, particularly in India, about the nature of the problems that we have with China, the kind of inheritance, the legacy that is only ours. We cannot obviously discount.
I want to congratulate you on the honesty with which you have written, because it's that honesty that created in my mind the overwhelming impression, and it's emerged consistently in my questions, that the primary responsibility and blame rests with Nehru. You provided the evidence in a very convincing and detailed way in your book that leads to that conclusion in my mind. I know you don't share it, which is why I began by pointing out that although you believe that the attempt to criticize Nehru and blame him is only a simple and default answer, it's not the outcome your book leaves in my mind, which is why I'm raising these questions. Your honesty has led to the conclusion that Nehru was primarily and mainly to blame. But one last question before we end, because you point out something I at least wasn't aware of, that from 1962 January onwards, that's roughly 10 months before war actually started, there were warnings from China that war could be a possibility, warnings given through diplomats in third countries. One of them was Cambodia, where I believe the warning was conveyed to the Indian ambassador. And again, these were ignored. I mean, I find it inexplicable, completely ignored.
Well, it came at a great cost to India, no wonder. There were obviously decisions or lapses in decision making that you see throughout my record of those times. And once again, let me center my response to your arguments on the fact that the nation needs a more reasoned acceptance and appreciation, more importantly, of what happened during those years. My intention, I'm sorry you have got the impression that my intention was to ultimately just, through this convoluted way.
No, not your intention. Not your intention at all. You make your intention clear in the introduction. It's not your intention that the primary blame should rest with Nehru, but the outcome of what you write, the outcome of the evidence you give, the outcome of everything that you tell us about Nehru's assumptions, his failure to understand Chinese signals, his wrong conviction we'd never go to war, the fact that he insisted upon Aksai Chin maps being shown as defined and clarified, even though, as you said in the interview, he wasn't sure in his own mind. All of that leads to the conclusion that the primary fault was Nehru's. It's not your intention. It's the unintended outcome of your book, but it's an overwhelming outcome. That's why I'm pursuing this line of questioning with you.
Karan, the lessons to be learned from this is not that, we have ultimately been able to pin Nehru down and he was responsible for everything that happened. That story has been spun many times over. And, if that's the conclusion you draw, maybe that is a shortcoming on my part. And I accept responsibility for it. But that was not my intention. My intention was to offer, as I said, an honest and a very clear and a detailed account of all that happened during those years, in order to enlighten people a little more about how complex.
You have enlightened people hugely, and there's no doubt about it. It's just that perhaps it wasn't your intention, but the outcome of the enlightenment is the overwhelming impression, at least in my mind, that the primary blame is Nehru's. For a variety of reasons we've discussed, let's not go over them. We've gone through them for the last 45 minutes. But it's an overwhelming impression. Let me end with one simple question. It's the last one.
Can I say something here? Can I just say something here, Karan?
Very quickly.
It won't take just half a minute. You understand the nature of tragedy. This was a tragedy. You understand the nature of the principal characters in a tragedy, that they are fatally flawed. Nehru was that kind of a tragic hero. That's
absolutely. You said it. When a tragic hero is fatally flawed, he can't help but lead to his own destruction. King Lear, Coriolanus in particular, right? But that's also true, by the way, of The Winter's Tale. And what it means is that the fault is his entirely. You're simply saying that he can't help himself. I agree. But the fault is his entirely. You made my point even better than I did with that correct comparison to Shakespearean and Greek tragedy. The fault and flaw was in him. There was nothing he could do about it. It was inevitable that it would end this way, but the fault is still his. My last question, and I think in a sense Nehru perhaps realized this when I asked this question. After the defeat in 1962, Nehru was a crushed man. He literally limped through the remaining 18 years of his life. And I put it to you that the reason he was crushed, the reason he was limping, is he realized and he accepted that it was his mistaken assumptions, it was his critical errors of judgment that had led to the debacle. In other words, he accepted the fault was his, he was to blame. That's why he was crushed.
I think he was an honest and honorable man. He accepted that he alone had to bear responsibility for all that had gone wrong. And I think therein lies the greatness of Nehru. You don't come across many leaders like that today.
All right. I'll leave you with that last word. Thank you very much for this interview. And thank you for making time to respond to an impression your book creates, which clearly, as I said, wasn't your intention. But be interesting to see how others respond to your book. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.